Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to complete our story in this video, Jane Eyre, and it will be our last video. Now let's answer these questions to check our understanding. Put the right name in the right place. You can use the same name more than once. We have the names Mr. Rochester, Jane Eyre, St. John, Diana, Mary, Mr. Briggs, Jane Eyre, Jane Elliot, Hannah. Arrived at a place where there were no towns or villages and very few houses. Who? Jane Eyre. They gave Jane a piece of bread. Hannah, the servant. Jane said her name was Jane Elliot. And why did she do this? Jane didn't want to find her. Who? Mr. Rochester. Jane became friends with Diana and Mary. Diana and Mary have a brother called St. John. Is a clergyman. St. John wants to find Jane Eyre. Mr. Briggs is St. John's mother's brother. Jane Eyre. St. John, Diana, Mary Rivers and are cousins. Jane Eyre. St. John wants to go to India with him as his wife. St. John wants who to go to India with him? Jane Eyre. Now let's complete our story. We're going to complete starting from page 32 till the end. The next day, Jane went to look for Mr. Rochester. After a long journey, Jane arrived to Thornfield Hall. She stood and looked. It was terrible. The wall of the house was still standing, but the windows were empty, dark, and there was no roof. The grass was long and there were no flowers in the garden. Jane hurried back to the village and asked a man about Thornfield. No one lived there now. Last autumn, Thornfield Hall burned down. It was terrible. The house burned in the middle of the night. The man said, "What did it happen?" Jane asked. They thought Mr. Rochester's wife started it. Nobody ever saw her. She was mad. People think she started a fire in her room in the attic. When it happened, the house was almost empty, but the little girl Adele was away at school, and old Mrs. Fairfax was staying with some friends many miles away. It seems that he did not want anybody at that time. People say he seemed very unhappy. They say that he wanted to marry a young woman, but she ran away, the man said. "Tell me about the fire." She was in the attic, but she jumped up onto the roof. I saw her shouting and waving her arms. He tried to help her, but he could do nothing. Suddenly, she fell from the roof and died. Mr. Rochester couldn't get out of the burning house in time. He was blind and he lost one hand. Jane asked, "Where does he live now?" The man continued, "When the fire started, Mr. Rochester got all the servants out of the house. Then he went back to save his wife." The man told her that he lives at Frendine, about 30 miles from here. He lives with 2 servants and he never has any visitors. Jane decided to go and she arrived before dark. The servant Mary opened the door of the house. She knew her at once. He was there, but he was different now. His face looked sad and he couldn't walk without help. "Tell Mr. Rochester that he has a visitor, but don't tell him who it is," Jane said. "Who's there? Is that you, Mary?" Mr. Rochester said. "Will you have some water?" Jane asked him. He was surprised and excited. Jane took his hand. "Jane, is it Jane? Is it really you?" he asked. "I'm so happy to be with you again. I will never leave you now," Jane said. Jane told him all about her cousins and that she's a rich woman now. But Rochester asked her if she's going to stay with him. "Of course I will," Jane said. Mr. Rochester looked suddenly happier and took her hands and asked her to marry him again. Jane felt really happy, and Mr. Rochester 3 days later, she became his wife. She wrote to her cousins. The news made them very happy. Jane also wrote to St. John, but he didn't answer. He traveled to India and worked hard. He never got married. Mr. Rochester and Jane were happy together. They have been married for 10 years now. 2 years after their marriage, he began to see with one eye. He could see her and their children. Their story was a strange and sad one, and terrible things happened to them. But they were very happy. Now, after reading, let's answer these questions. When Jane returns to Thornfield, it has no roof or it's completely gone? It will be, it has no roof. A. People think that Mr. Rochester burned the house down or Mr. Rochester's wife burned the house down. The answer will be B. Mr. Rochester's wife burned the house down. 3. Mr. Rochester tried to save his wife, but she fell from the roof and died, or she killed herself with a knife. The answer will be A. She fell from the roof and died. When Mr. Rochester came out of the house, he had lost both hands, or he was blind and had lost a hand. The answer will be B. He was blind and he had lost a hand. 5. Jane goes to see Mr. Rochester and they marry 3 days later, or they marry 2 years later. The answer will be A. They marry 3 days later. 6. 2 years after they marry, Mr. Rochester begins to see again with one eye, or can see again with both eyes. The answer will be A. Mr. Rochester begins to see again with one eye. Thanks for listening. I hope you have enjoyed your story, and try to think of these answers. It's about the whole story. Why was the story of Jane and Mr. Rochester a strange and sad one? And what terrible things happened to them? And of course, we know how many terrible things they had faced. I wish you answered these questions and send it to me. And thanks for listening again.